Most people assume that eating liver is either an outdated habit or an extreme choice reserved for people chasing quick nutritional wins. The assumption is that modern diets and supplements have made foods like liver unnecessary, or that its benefits are exaggerated and risky. Yet, when you look closely at human physiology, nutrient systems, and long-term biological maintenance, liver quietly sits at an uncomfortable intersection. It is one of the most nutrient-dense foods humans have ever eaten, yet also one of the most misunderstood. The tension lies in this contradiction. How can a food so concentrated be both potentially supportive and potentially problematic, depending on context, dose, and biology? To understand this properly, you need to step away from trends and look at how the body actually uses nutrients over time, how it prioritizes repair versus storage, and why certain tissues evolve to concentrate specific compounds. Once you see this, liver stops being a superfood or a villain and becomes something far more interesting, a biological tool that only makes sense when you understand the system it interacts with. Longevity is not built from single nutrients acting in isolation. It is shaped by how the body maintains cells, replaces damaged components, and manages trade-offs between growth, repair, and defense. The liver, as a food, reflects this principle almost perfectly. Animal liver is not muscle meat. It is a metabolic organ that stores, processes, and redistributes nutrients for the animal itself. When humans eat liver, they are consuming a concentrated snapshot of how mammalian biology prioritizes survival. This is why liver contains unusually high levels of certain vitamins, minerals, and cofactors that are not evenly distributed across other foods. Vitamin A appears in a form that is already biologically active. B vitamins are present in combinations that mirror the needs of cellular energy metabolism. Iron comes packaged with proteins that influence how it is absorbed and used. These features matter because longevity is less about maximizing intake and more about maintaining balance over decades. One of the most overlooked aspects of eating liver is how it interacts with nutrient signaling rather than simple deficiency correction. Many nutrients in liver act as regulators. Vitamin A, for example, does not simply support vision or immunity in a linear way. It influences gene expression, cell differentiation, and tissue maintenance. In appropriate amounts, it helps cells mature correctly and supports immune surveillance. In excess, it can disrupt these same processes. This duality is uncomfortable in modern nutrition discussions because it resists simple recommendations. Longevity depends on avoiding chronic excess, just as much as avoiding deficiency, and liver sits right at that threshold. This is why traditional diets that included liver almost always did so intermittently rather than daily, even before anyone understood biochemistry. Iron is another example of this balance. Iron deficiency is common worldwide, but iron excess is increasingly recognized as a risk factor for oxidative stress and accelerated aging in certain populations. Liver contains heme iron, which is absorbed efficiently and bypasses many of the regulatory steps that control plant-based iron absorption. This can be beneficial for individuals with low iron stores or increased needs, but over time, repeated high intake without physiological demand can lead to accumulation. Iron is essential for oxygen transport and mitochondrial function, but free iron can catalyze reactions that damage lipids, proteins, and DNA. Longevity is not about pushing oxygen delivery higher and higher. It is about maintaining efficient energy production without unnecessary molecular damage. Liver, again, is powerful, but not neutral. As you zoom out, liver starts to make sense as a periodic input rather than a staple. From a systems perspective, it provides nutrients that are difficult to obtain in meaningful amounts from muscle meat alone, especially nutrients involved in methylation, detoxification pathways, and cellular repair. Choline is one such compound. It supports liver function in humans, contributes to phospholipid synthesis for cell membranes, and plays a role in neurotransmitter production. Adequate choline status is associated with healthier lipid metabolism and reduced risk of fatty liver disease, a condition that becomes more prevalent with age. When choline intake is chronically low, the body compensates poorly, and subtle dysfunction accumulates over years. Liver provides choline in a form that is readily usable, which may explain why populations that included organ meats historically showed lower rates of certain metabolic disorders, despite lower overall caloric intake. Another dimension often ignored is how liver consumption interacts with protein quality rather than quantity. Liver protein contains a different amino acid profile compared to muscle meat, with higher levels of glycine and other amino acids involved in collagen synthesis and detoxification reactions. Longevity research increasingly suggests that excessive intake of certain amino acids may accelerate aging pathways, while balanced profiles support maintenance and repair. Liver does not push protein intake dramatically higher, but it shifts the composition in subtle ways that may influence long-term metabolic signaling. This does not mean liver is a magic solution, but it does mean it plays a different role than a steak or chicken breast. As the narrative deepens, it becomes clear that liver is less about short-term benefit and more about strategic inclusion. Populations that lived long lives traditionally did not eat liver because it was fashionable or because they believed it would cure disease. They ate it because it was scarce, valued, and understood intuitively as something to be consumed with respect. Scarcity itself acted as a safety mechanism. Modern abundance removes that constraint, which is why liver supplementation and daily consumption raise legitimate concerns. Supplements bypass the sensory and cultural cues that historically limited intake. Pills make it easy to ignore dose, frequency, and individual variation. From a longevity standpoint, this is not a trivial issue. The question then becomes how liver fits into a modern context without turning into either fear or obsession. Aging is driven by cumulative cellular stress, declining repair capacity, and dysregulated nutrient sensing. Foods that support longevity tend to do so by gently reinforcing existing systems rather than forcing change. Liver provides cofactors that support DNA repair enzymes, antioxidant systems, and immune cell turnover. Selenium, zinc, copper, and B vitamins all participate in these processes, but they only work optimally within a narrow range. Liver delivers them together, which may reduce the risk of imbalance compared to isolated supplementation, but only if intake is infrequent and moderate. There is also the question of bioavailability versus adaptability. Highly bioavailable nutrients are not always better for longevity. They are better for correcting deficiencies quickly, but longevity favors adaptability, the body's ability to adjust intake, storage, and excretion over time. When nutrients arrive slowly and variably, regulatory systems stay engaged. When they arrive in large, concentrated doses repeatedly, regulation can weaken. Liver sits closer to the concentrated end of this spectrum, which is why frequency matters more than portion size alone. This nuance is often lost in simplified nutrition advice. As you move further into the long-term view, the role of liver becomes clearer when compared to the decline in nutrient density of modern diets. Many people consume sufficient calories, but insufficient micronutrients, leading to subtle deficiencies that do not cause immediate illness, but erode resilience over time. In this context, occasional liver consumption can act as a corrective input, replenishing stores that are otherwise difficult to maintain. This may support immune competence, cognitive function, and metabolic stability as people age. The key word is occasional. Longevity is not built by repeating the same stimulus endlessly, but by introducing variety that challenges and supports the system without overwhelming it. Another overlooked aspect is how liver consumption interacts with aging-related changes in digestion and absorption. As people age, stomach acid production often declines, which impairs absorption of certain minerals and B vitamins. Liver provides these nutrients in forms that are less dependent on optimal digestive conditions. This may partially offset age-related declines in absorption efficiency. However, this advantage does not eliminate the risks of excess. Aging also reduces the body's ability to buffer mistakes, making moderation even more important later in life. The conversation around liver and longevity often becomes polarized because it sits at the intersection of ancestral practices and modern science. Ancestral does not mean optimal by default, and modern does not mean superior by default. When examined through the lens of mechanisms, liver emerges as a food that supports longevity only when it respects biological limits. It is not something to add on top of an already nutrient-rich, high-calorie diet without adjustment. It works best when it replaces less nutrient-dense foods, not when it stacks on top of them. As the final understanding settles in, liver stops being a recommendation and becomes a context-dependent option. For individuals with low intake of certain micronutrients, limited dietary variety, or increased needs during specific life stages, liver can provide meaningful support to long-term health. For individuals already consuming high amounts of fortified foods and supplements, adding liver indiscriminately may do more harm than good over time. Longevity is about reducing friction within biological systems, not overwhelming them with intensity. In the end, eating liver for longevity is not about chasing maximal nutrition. It is about respecting how the body evolved to handle concentrated resources. Liver is a reminder that more is not better, that density requires restraint, and that long life is built on steady, balanced inputs rather than dramatic interventions. When approached with this mindset, liver becomes neither outdated nor extreme, but simply another tool that only works when used with understanding. Most conversations about eating liver quietly assume that if something is nutrient-dense, more exposure must move you closer to longevity. That assumption feels logical, but biologically it is fragile. Longevity is not driven by abundance. It is driven by control. The body is not designed to be flooded with concentrated inputs repeatedly. It is designed to regulate scarcity, variation, and recovery. Liver challenges this because it concentrates signals that the body normally encounters sparingly. The mistake most people make is treating liver like an optimized upgrade rather than a stressor that only helps when applied correctly. The first misuse is frequency. When liver is eaten too often, its strongest nutrients stop behaving like support and start behaving like pressure. Vitamin A is the clearest example. In whole foods, vitamin A exists in a form the body cannot easily discard. Unlike water-soluble vitamins, excess is not simply excreted. It is stored, mainly in the liver itself. Small, infrequent doses reinforce normal cell differentiation and immune balance. Chronic exposure, even at amounts that feel moderate, can disrupt bone remodeling, interfere with vitamin D signaling, and increase cellular stress. None of this shows up immediately. That is what makes it dangerous in the context of longevity. Damage that accumulates slowly is rarely attributed to the food that caused it. Iron follows the same pattern. Iron deficiency is easy to detect and widely discussed. Iron excess is quiet, slow, and often ignored. Heme iron from liver bypasses many of the body's regulatory gates. In individuals who already have adequate iron stores, repeated intake increases the pool of unbound iron over time. Free iron accelerates oxidative reactions that damage membranes and mitochondria. Aging is in large part the gradual failure of mitochondria to produce energy efficiently without collateral damage. Excess iron makes that failure more likely, not less. This is why populations with genetically higher iron absorption often experience higher rates of metabolic and cardiovascular issues later in life when intake is not carefully moderated. Another misuse is context stacking. Liver is often added on top of modern diets that are already fortified, supplemented, and calorie-dense. This creates overlap rather than balance. Fortified foods already supply synthetic vitamin A, analogs, iron, and B vitamins. Supplements often add more. Liver then becomes the final push that tips intake from adequate into excessive. Traditional diets did not have this problem because they lacked fortification and supplementation. Liver filled gaps. In modern diets, it often overfills them. Longevity depends on avoiding chronic redundancy. Biological systems are resilient to scarcity, but fragile under overload. There is also a misunderstanding about tolerance. Many people assume that because liver is a natural food, the body will simply adapt. Adaptation has limits. Detoxification pathways themselves require nutrients and energy. When intake repeatedly exceeds what the body can safely buffer, adaptation gives way to compensation, and compensation accelerates wear. The liver as an organ works continuously to protect the body from excess. Eating liver too frequently places an ironic burden on the very system it is meant to support. Over decades, that burden matters. Another subtle issue is individual variation. Genetics, sex, age, and hormonal status all influence how nutrients are handled. For example, individuals who no longer menstruate accumulate iron more easily. Aging reduces renal and hepatic clearance efficiency. What was tolerated in early adulthood may not be tolerated later. Longevity nutrition cannot be static across life stages. Liver consumption that is harmless or helpful at one stage may become counterproductive at another. This is rarely acknowledged in simplified advice. Even protein signaling deserves scrutiny. Liver contains amino acids that influence growth and repair pathways. In younger individuals, this supports regeneration. In older individuals, excessive activation of growth pathways may compete with cellular cleanup mechanisms such as autophagy. Longevity research increasingly shows that periods of lower stimulation are just as important as nourishment. Constant signaling, even from whole foods, can suppress the body's internal maintenance cycles. Liver, because of its density, delivers a strong signal. Strong signals should not be continuous. There is also the psychological misuse. Liver is often framed as a shortcut, a way to compensate for otherwise inconsistent habits. This mindset undermines longevity more than any nutrient imbalance. Long life emerges from systems that are boring, repetitive, and restrained. When a food becomes symbolic of optimization, it tends to be overused. The body does not reward symbolic behavior. It responds to patterns. When you look at populations that included liver historically, a consistent theme emerges. Liver was seasonal, shared, and secondary. It was not consumed daily. It was not isolated from the rest of the diet. It was respected because it was potent. That respect is missing in modern interpretations. Potency without restraint accelerates imbalance. The correct way to think about liver is not as a health food, but as a biological intervention. Interventions are defined by timing, dose, and recovery. Liver works best when intake is separated by enough time for nutrient stores to normalize and signaling pathways to reset. This spacing preserves sensitivity. Sensitivity is central to longevity. Insulin sensitivity, nutrient sensitivity, hormonal sensitivity, and immune sensitivity all decline when systems are overstimulated. Liver overuse contributes to that decline rather than preventing it. From a longevity perspective, the most dangerous thing about liver is not toxicity in the acute sense. It is the illusion of safety created by familiarity. It is meat. It is traditional. It is praised. That combination lowers vigilance. Longevity requires vigilance against slow damage, not fear of immediate harm. So, liver is not a mistake. Misusing liver is. When included with awareness, spacing, and restraint, it can support long-term resilience by replenishing nutrients that modern diets often lack. When consumed frequently, stacked on top of fortified foods, or used as a substitute for systemic balance, it quietly undermines the very longevity people seek. The takeaway is not to avoid liver, but to demote it from habit to tool. Tools are used deliberately, not reflexively. Longevity belongs to those who understand that intensity is not the same as effectiveness, and that the body thrives not on constant stimulation, but on intelligent restraint. If liver is removed or reduced, the real question is what biological role it was meant to play in the first place. Liver does not exist in the diet to impress nutrient charts. It exists to solve specific problems that emerge when diets drift toward uniformity. Modern eating patterns tend to rely on a narrow range of foods, repeated daily, optimized for convenience rather than biological diversity. Over time, this narrows micronutrient exposure and weakens redundancy in metabolic systems. Liver historically countered that narrowing. It was not special because it was extreme, but because it was different. From a longevity standpoint, the goal is not to defend liver, but to defend variation. Variation keeps regulatory systems responsive. It prevents any single pathway from dominating for too long. Liver happens to deliver variation in a concentrated form, which is why it must be treated with caution. But variation itself is non-negotiable. If liver is used rarely, it should coincide with periods of lower overall nutrient load. That means it fits better in diets that are otherwise simple, unfortified, and restrained. It fits poorly in diets already saturated with added vitamins, protein isolates, and constant feeding windows. Timing also matters more than people realize. The body does not process nutrients in a vacuum. Nutrient handling changes with circadian rhythms, insulin sensitivity, and inflammatory tone. Dense foods like liver are better tolerated when the body is primed for assimilation rather than storage. Chronic grazing blurs that distinction. Longevity favors clear cycles of input and processing. Liver works best when it punctuates those cycles, not when it flattens them. Another underappreciated factor is how liver consumption interacts with appetite regulation. Because liver is rich in micronutrients that influence satiety hormones and neurotransmitter synthesis, it can temporarily suppress appetite or shift food preferences. In a balanced system, this can reduce overconsumption of empty calories. In an unbalanced system, it can mask deeper regulatory issues. Longevity depends on honest appetite signaling. Foods that override appetite repeatedly, even subtly, can interfere with that feedback loop. Liver should support appetite clarity, not replace it. There is also the issue of quality and sourcing, which becomes more important as intake becomes less frequent. When something is consumed rarely, its quality carries more weight. Liver concentrates not only nutrients but also whatever the animal was exposed to. Environmental toxins, heavy metals, and fat-soluble contaminants accumulate in organs more readily than in muscle meat. This does not make liver inherently dangerous, but it reinforces the principle of intentionality. Longevity is built by reducing unnecessary exposures, not just adding beneficial ones. As people age, another shift occurs that reframes liver entirely. The aging body becomes less tolerant of extremes but more sensitive to signals. Small inputs have larger effects. This is where liver, used sparingly, may exert disproportionate influence. A small amount can restore micronutrient adequacy without overwhelming clearance systems. This is the opposite of the supplement mindset, which often escalates dose as perceived need increases. Longevity rewards the opposite behavior. Lower dose, higher awareness. What ultimately emerges is a pattern that looks boring from the outside, but elegant internally. Most days are built on simple, repeatable foods that the body handles effortlessly. Occasionally, something dense and information-rich enters the system, challenges it briefly, and then leaves. The system adapts, recalibrates, and becomes more resilient. Liver fits only into that occasional role. When it becomes routine, it stops teaching the system anything new. The deeper lesson here is not about liver itself, but about how people misunderstand longevity nutrition. Longevity is not a collection of powerful inputs. It is the art of preserving sensitivity. Every time a food stops eliciting a response, its value drops. Overuse is not neutral. It is information loss. Liver, when overused, becomes background noise rather than a signal. So the correct framing is not whether liver is good or bad, but whether its use preserves or erodes biological responsiveness over time. When it preserves responsiveness, it belongs. When it erodes it, it quietly accelerates aging under the illusion of nourishment. If you want, the next step can go one of two ways. We can translate this into a clean, defensible positioning statement for your channel that differentiates you from supplement-driven longevity content. Or we can build the next speech that zooms out further and tackles the broader myth of nutrient optimization versus system preservation. At this point, the conversation naturally widens beyond liver, because liver is only useful as an example of a much larger principle that most longevity content gets wrong. Longevity is not the result of accumulating advantages. It is the result of avoiding small, repeated mistakes that compound quietly over time. Foods like liver expose this mistake very clearly because they sit at the edge of tolerance. They force you to confront how the body actually works rather than how nutrition is marketed. The human body evolved to operate under fluctuating conditions. Periods of abundance were followed by periods of simplicity. Signals arrived, faded, and arrived again. Repair mechanisms were activated precisely because stimulation was not constant. Aging accelerates when this rhythm collapses, when stimulation becomes continuous, and recovery becomes incomplete. This is why diets that look nutritionally impressive on paper often perform poorly over decades. They remove variability in the name of optimization. Liver, when eaten too often, contributes to this flattening of rhythm. It compresses what should be occasional signals into a steady background input. Vitamin A signaling no longer pulses. Iron handling no longer fluctuates. Growth and repair cues blur together. Over time, the body responds by dampening sensitivity. Dampened sensitivity is one of the defining features of aging. It shows up as insulin resistance, hormonal resistance, immune exhaustion, and impaired stress responses. None of these appear suddenly. They emerge because the system is never allowed to fully reset. This is why longevity nutrition cannot be reduced to what you eat, but must include how often and under what conditions. A food that is supportive in a sparse context can become harmful in a dense one. Liver illustrates this perfectly. In a diet low in fortified foods, low in supplements, and built around whole ingredients, occasional liver can restore balance. In a diet already saturated with added nutrients and constant feeding, the same liver becomes excess. The food does not change. The system does. Another mistake people make is assuming that longevity requires constant intervention. In reality, longevity is preserved by restraint more often than by action. The body already knows how to maintain itself when interference is minimal and inputs are appropriate. Foods like liver should be used to correct drift, not to chase improvement. Correction is subtle. Chasing improvement is aggressive. Aggression ages systems faster than scarcity ever did. When you reframe liver this way, it stops being controversial. It becomes predictable. Predictable inputs produce predictable outcomes. Dense inputs require spacing. Potent signals require recovery. Aging accelerates when either rule is ignored. This logic applies to food, exercise, supplementation, and even cognitive stimulation. Longevity is not a stack, it is a cadence. If someone asks whether eating liver will help them live longer, the honest answer is that liver will not add years by itself. What it can do, when used intelligently, is reduce the slow erosion caused by micronutrient inadequacy and dietary monotony. It can support systems that quietly fail when neglected, but it cannot override excess, poor timing, or chronic overstimulation. No food can. The uncomfortable truth is that many people drawn to liver for longevity are actually responding to a deeper intuition that something is missing in modern diets. That intuition is valid. The mistake is addressing it with intensity instead of precision. Precision favors less, not more. Precision favors timing over quantity. Precision favors understanding systems over chasing effects. Seen through this lens, liver becomes a litmus test. If someone can include it sparingly, without obsession, without stacking, and without turning it into an identity, they likely understand longevity at a systems level. If they cannot, liver will not save them. It will simply expose the same pattern that shortens lifespan in other ways, the inability to leave well enough alone. Longevity is built by protecting sensitivity, preserving rhythm, and respecting limits that are invisible until they are crossed. Liver belongs in that story, only when it is used with restraint. Not because it is dangerous, but because it is powerful. And power, in biology, is only beneficial when it is used sparingly. If you want, the next step can be to convert this entire arc into a single, uninterrupted 1-hour master script polished for narration. Or we can pivot to the next topic that reinforces the same philosophy, such as why constant supplementation quietly accelerates aging, or why nutrient timing matters more than nutrient quantity.